What if I told you that a national government just erased over $40 billion of assets from its central bank's balance sheet overnight?
Right, which sounds...
And instead of triggering like a total economic collapse, it was actually hailed by rigorous economists as this massive leap forward for financial transparency.
Yeah, it sounds completely counterintuitive. I mean, in the private sector, if you vaporize that much asset value on a ledger, the doors are padlocked by regulators on a Friday afternoon.
Exactly, you're going to jail.
Right, you're going to jail. But when we're talking about the sovereign level specifically, the really complex plumbing of central banks downsizing a balance sheet by tens of billions of dollars can actually be the exact thing that saves the currency.
Okay, so today we are opening the vault of the Central Bank of the Argentine Republic, the BCRA.
Yeah.
And the mission of this deep dive for you, the listener, is to unpack the financial mechanics of how government actually goes about dismantling this massive, decades-long economic time bomb.
It's a huge undertaking.
Right. We're going to look really closely at the accounting, the mathematical gymnastics, I guess you call it, and the reality of what happens when a country owes billions of dollars entirely to itself.
And to do this with the required academic rigor, because we really need to be precise here, we are relying on a highly specific stack of sources.
Not just news headlines.
Definitely not just headlines. We're diving into independent economic and credit analyses authored by Claude and Grok. And these were developed with detailed prompts, economic framing, and inputs by GeorgeChiesa.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and these papers examine a remarkably candid, deeply technical academic session that was given by the BCRA governor himself, Santiago Bausili.
Right, at the University of Buenos Aires.
Exactly, the Faculty of Economic Sciences, or FCE-UBA.
Yeah.
And alongside that, we'll be looking directly at the official texts of the executive decrees that actually operationalize this cleanup.
Which are Decree 23-2024 and Decree 2000-2024 from the Bulletin Official. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand what's happening on the Argentine balance sheet right now, we have to establish the context, right? The absolute core mandate of this current situation.
Which is crucial to frame correctly.
So the present government took power on December 10th, 2023, and they arrived with a very explicit mandate, which was to clean up a historic fiscal and monetary mess left by prior administrations.
That date, December 10th, 2023, is basically ground zero for this entire operation. But before we get into the cleanup itself, I have to offer a structural warning for you, the listener.
Oh, a warning.
Well, yeah, because when we discuss central bank balance sheets, we have to use correct, rigorous financial terminology. We're going to be talking about assets, liabilities, nominal value, recoverable value, and intra-government claims.
It gets dense.
It does. The plumbing of sovereign finance is incredibly counterintuitive. In fact, our sources note that even highly tech-savvy people in academia, and frankly, even some people working within the central bank itself, often get the math wrong here.
Which makes total sense because sovereign accounting doesn't behave like, your household checking account.
Not at all.
So to appreciate the bomb squad currently at work, we really have to understand how this financial bomb was built in the first place. Let's trace this back.
Right.
Our sources pinpoint the origin of what Argentines refer to as the PapelitosdeColores, the colorful little papers. And this starts way back in January 2006.
Yes, 2006 is really the genesis of this specific mechanism. At that time, the Kirchner government made a high-profile political and economic decision to completely pay off Argentina's debt to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF.
Which was how much?
The total amount was roughly $9.5 billion. Now, from a public relations standpoint, paying off the IMF sounds fantastic.
Oh, yeah, sovereign independence, clearing external debt, it's a great headline.
Exactly. But the critical macroeconomic question is always...
Where did the money come from?
Right, where did the liquidity actually come from?
Because the government doesn't just find $9.5 billion in the couch cushions. They had to source that hard currency from somewhere.
They did. And they sourced it by utilizing the international reserves of the central bank.
Okay, wait.
The government effectively took $9.5 billion of real hard currency from the central bank's vault to pay the external creditor.
But a central bank has a balance sheet that has a balance.
Always.
So if you remove an asset like the actual foreign exchange reserves, you have to replace it with something. Otherwise, wouldn't you contract the monetary base and cause severe deflation?
Or cause immense deflationary pain. So to balance it, the Treasury gave the central bank a piece of paper, a 10-year non-transferable bill. In Spanish, a letra intransferable.
Okay, I want to ground this in a structural analogy so the mechanics are perfectly clear for the listener.
Sure.
Imagine you own a mid-sized manufacturing business, and you decide you want to buy a luxury yacht personally, but you don't have the cash.
Okay, I like where this is going.
However, your business has a massive cash reserve in its corporate accounts. So you walk in, you take the cash out of the business to buy your yacht, and you just drop a signed sticky note in the corporate safe that says, I owe the business this much money.
Right.
And when the auditors come, you tell them, hey, the business is perfectly healthy. Look at the sticky note. It's an asset.
Yeah.
That is effectively what the Treasury did to the central bank.
That is a highly accurate mechanical comparison. That sticky note is a letra intransferable. It is an intra-public sector claim.
So it's just the government owing itself.
Exactly. One arm of the state, the Treasury owes another arm of the state, the central bank. Now, if this had been a one-time emergency maneuver in 2006, it would just be a historical footnote.
Right.
But as our rigorous analysis details, this became a systemic addiction. This pattern repeated continuously from 2006 all the way up to 2023.
Wow.
Whenever the government needed to finance massive fiscal deficits or required hard currency, they raided the central bank's real reserves and replaced them with these non-transferable sticky notes.
So it's not just one sticky note for a yacht. It's 17 years of putting sticky notes in the safe until the safe is literally overflowing with them, while the actual real cash is completely gone.
Precisely. Over those 17 years, the stock of these non-transferable bills reached an astonishing 67 to 70 billion US dollars in nominal value.
70 billion.
Yes. The central bank was progressively hollowed out. Its real hard currency reserves were entirely depleted, replaced by non-collectible intrastate paper.
And you say non-collectible because
the Treasury did not have the fiscal surplus to pay them back. Furthermore, these instruments were not marketable. The central bank couldn't just take them to Wall Street and sell them to a third-party investor for cash.
Right, because nobody would buy a sticky note that the Argentine Treasury wrote to itself.
Exactly. They were entirely trapped on the central bank's balance sheet, serving as a massive accounting fiction.
And this leads us to the absolute heart of the accounting gymnastics. Because, how do you value a $70 billion sticky note that everyone from the Treasury to the local shopkeeper knows you can't actually cash in?
It's a profound problem.
Our sources point out that this valuation question was the center of a massive institutional battle. At one point, a previous interim government actually looked at this mess and tried to enforce a reality check, right?
They did, yeah. An earlier administration recognized that carrying these intra-government claims at 100% of their face value, their nominal value, was pure fiction.
Right.
So they applied a correct cautionary accounting rule. They mandated that these papelitos be held at a lower, more realistic recoverability value on the books. They essentially tried to let some of the air out of the balloon.
But then politics intervened.
Exactly. In 2019, when the Kirchner government returned to power, they deliberately reversed that prudent accounting rule.
Of course they did.
They mandated a return to the fiction. They forced the central bank to put it back to full par value, valuing these deeply impaired, uncollectible IOUs at 100% on the asset side of the ledger.
Okay, I have to stop you there because there's a massive contradiction here.
Yeah.
If a private commercial bank tried to claim a clearly defaulted, uncollectible loan was worth 100 cents on the dollar, the executives would be facing fraud charges.
Without a doubt.
So how did the government legally justify forcing the central bank to pretend these were as good as solid gold bars?
It sets up a fascinating clash between strict legal formalism and macroeconomic reality. From a purely formal, legalistic perspective, the argument is that a sovereign state cannot default on itself, and the Treasury is backed by the full taxing power of the nation.
Okay.
Therefore, the traditional legal argument states that the Treasury has to pay at par eventually, because the issuer and the holder are sister entities within the consolidated state. Standard sovereign accounting often provides this loophole.
A loophole loophole to just pretend everything is fine.
Basically, it allows them to value these claims at nominal value, theoretically assuming the state will always honor its internal commitments.
But that's a legal loophole that completely ignores the actual math of the economy. I mean, it doesn't matter if the state theoretically has to pay if the state mathematically cannot pay.
Precisely. If we evaluate this through the lens of economic reality, these legacy claims were deeply impaired. They carried low or near zero real yields in hard currency terms, they had incredibly long maturities, and there was a 17-year track record of the government simply rolling them over or ignoring them completely.
Right.
By forcing the central bank to value them at nominal par value, the 2019 government inflated the asset side of the central bank with an artificial number, effectively masking the fact that the institution was fundamentally hollow.
So let's cut to December 10th, 2023. The new government takes power with a mandate to clean up the prior mess. They walk into the central bank, open the vault, and find $70 billion worth of colorful little papers, practically zero usable real reserves, and a ticking clock on their immediate real-world external debts.
It was a dire situation.
But this brings us to an incredibly controversial early move. Faced with this massive fiction, they had to take an action that, on the surface, looks entirely hypocritical.
You're referring to Decree 23/2024,
Yes.
issued in January 2024, just a few weeks into the new administration. The government authorized an operation to issue its own non-transferable letra to draw approximately $3.2 billion or 3,200 MUSD from the BCRA.
Okay, I can guarantee that anyone listening right now is throwing their hands up.
Oh, I know.
We just spent 10 minutes establishing that issuing non-transferable letras to raid the central bank is the exact toxic mechanism that hollowed out the Argentine economy for nearly 2 decades.
Yes.
And the very first thing this new cleanup government does is issue a letra to extract another $3.2 billion. I wonder if that's acceptable.
It is a vital point of contention, and our analytical sources, Grok and Claude, framed by GeorgeChiesa, are explicitly candid about this. They put a massive asterisk on this operation.
So they called them out on it.
Well, they noted that the present government was not a pure, pristine bystander in those first chaotic weeks. They utilized the very toxic instrument they were elected to dismantle.
Right.
However, the rigorous economic analysis makes it explicitly clear. While the mechanism was identical to the past, the context made this 3,200 MUSD operation an absolutely necessary short-term measure to defuse the immediate bomb the prior government had left on their desks.
Tactical survival.
Oh.
Let me see if I can frame this without relying on tired cliches.
Let's hear it.
It's like taking over a hospital that has been deliberately mismanaged for years. You arrive on day one with a mandate to rebuild the surgical wing and fire all the corrupt administrators. But the moment you walk through the door, a patient arrives in cardiac arrest, and the only functioning defibrillator you have was bought using embezzled funds. You don't refuse to use the defibrillator because of its origin. You use it to keep the patient alive today. So you have the opportunity to reform the hospital tomorrow.
That is exactly the dynamic at play. The new administration inherited immediate, inflexible, hard currency debt obligations to external creditors that were maturing in January.
So they had to pay up or default.
Exactly. If they had defaulted on those external debts within their first 30 days, the resulting massive spike in country risk and the immediate closure of all international credit lines would have collapsed their entire macroeconomic stabilization plan before it even began.
And the vault was empty.
The BCRA was entirely depleted of usable liquid reserves.
So they needed hard currency to avoid an immediate default. And the only mechanism legally available to them in that 30-day window was the old toxic mechanism.
Correct. The $3.2 billion figure, while substantial, must be viewed in proportion to the $70 billion inherited stock. It was a required stopgap. The sources conclude that in the extreme short term, as a bridge to comprehensive reform, this move was acceptable and necessary.
Okay, I get it. But you can't run a stabilization plan on emergency triage forever.
No, you cannot.
Eventually, you have to fix the hospital. You have to implement a structural fix to stop the bleeding. And more importantly, you have to force the central bank's ledger to reflect actual reality, not political fiction.
And that pivot point arrives in March 2024.
With Decree 280/2024.
Yes. Decree 280 in 2024 is the structural watershed moment. Specifically, Article 14 of this decree substituted the 2019 accounting rules and mandated a return to rigorous standards.
Reinstating the cautionary rule.
Precisely. It required that all these non-transferable bills, the entire $70 billion stock of Letras and transferables, must be registered on the BCRA's portfolio using generally accepted accounting standards, or GAAP.
Now, changing an accounting standard sounds like dry bureaucratic housekeeping. But in the context of a sovereign balance sheet built on lies, enforcing GAAP is like forcing an aggressive real estate appraisal.
That's a good way to put it.
You can't just tell the bank your house is worth $5 million because you wrote that number on a napkin 10 years ago. The bank brings in an independent appraiser who looks at the foundation, the neighborhood, and what a buyer would actually pay for it today.
Right.
So Decree 280 forced a brutal, honest appraisal on the government's own debt.
That is the exact mechanism of GAAP in this scenario. Under these standards, you cannot arbitrarily carry a completely illiquid, uncollectible piece of paper at 100% of its face value.
So what did they do?
The BCRA implemented this decree by valuing the Letras at what is formally called amortized cost cap at recoverable value.
Let's translate recoverable value into hard numbers for the listener. What did that actually mean for the $70 billion stockpile?
It meant looking at what the open market would realistically pay for similar marketable Argentine sovereign bonds that actually traded. In practice, this meant applying a massive haircut.
How massive?
It required valuing the $70 billion nominal stock at roughly 33% of its face value.
33%.
Yeah.
So basically overnight, with a stroke of a pen enforcing standard accounting rules, a roughly $70 billion asset is marked down to about $22.9 billion. They just erased over $40 billion of assets from the central bank's books.
To be precise, they didn't erase them. They officially acknowledged that the value had already been erased over the previous 17 years.
Wow.
The BCRA recognized a massive accounting loss of over 40 trillion Argentine pesos in its financial statements for that period. It was a brutal, transparent recognition of a past pillage. And as our sources carefully note, this effectively reinstated the prior correct cautionary rule that the interim government had utilized before the 2019 reversal.
But wait, I have to push back here.
Sure.
If a central bank suddenly admits that $40 billion of its core assets are practically worthless, doesn't that make the bank technically insolvent overnight? Like, if I'm an international investor looking at a central bank with a massive, sudden negative net worth, why wouldn't I panic and short the peso immediately? How did they survive dropping that kind of accounting bomb without triggering hyperinflation the next morning?
That is the crucial distinction between a corporate balance sheet and a fiat central bank balance sheet.
Okay, walk me through that.
A private bank becomes insolvent and faces a run when its liabilities exceed its assets because its depositors demand real money. A central bank, however, issues the fiat currency itself. Its liabilities are mostly the monetary base, the physical pesos circulating in the economy.
Right.
The market didn't panic and short the peso when Decree 280 was announced because the market already knew the dollars were gone. The market had been pricing in that $40 billion hole for years through the exchange rate and inflation. The accounting move didn't reveal new weakness. It revealed a new institutional willingness to be honest about existing weakness.
It's the difference between discovering you have a disease today versus your doctor finally writing down the diagnosis of a disease you've been visibly suffering from for a decade.
Exactly. The market rewards the honesty.
But this still sparks a fierce legal debate among economists, right? Because admitting the asset is impaired doesn't necessarily change the legal contract. What does the analysis say about that?
It's a highly nuanced debate we must explore, and the sources do a great job of unpacking this. They acknowledge a traditional legalistic critique.
Which is what?
This critique argues that prudence in accounting, so marking something down to reflect real market value, is not inherently a legal license to redeem the debt below par.
Right. So from a strict legal standpoint, the Treasury still owes the central bank the full 100% nominal value.
Exactly. The legal critics are saying just because you admit the corporate cash you took to buy your yacht was a bad internal loan doesn't mean you don't still legally owe your business the full original amount you borrowed.
Okay, so they're arguing that forcing a market value on an intra-government, non-marketable IOU creates this artificial loss that undermines the legal sanctity of sovereign debt.
That is the formal argument. However, as the first paper by Claude and GeorgeChiesa explicitly acknowledges, in this specific historical instance, economic reality prevailed over strict legal formalities.
Which makes sense.
Maintaining the debt at nominal value just preserved an accounting fiction and delayed the ultimate political reckoning. The aggressive mark-to-recoverable value approach forced radical transparency.
Okay, so the books are finally clean. Or at least the ledger now reflects the painful, rusted-out reality that the safe is full of sticky notes worth roughly 33 cents on the dollar.
Right.
But transparency isn't a strategy on its own. What does the government actually do with these deeply devalued internal debts? Like, how do you physically get them out of the central bank?
That leads us to a really complex sequence of maneuvers, a tale of two very different swap operations. Let's call them Operation A and Operation B.
Let's do it.
Now that the Papelitos are correctly valued at roughly 33%, the government initiates asset swaps to permanently remove them from the BCRA's balance sheet.
Okay.
Operation A takes place around May 2025. In this operation, the central bank surrenders these highly impaired, non-transferable claims back to the Treasury. In exchange, the central bank receives $12 billion in liquid, real external dollars, sourced from a new program tranche with the IMF.
Real, hard, enforceable currency.
Exactly. This is genuine recapitalization. To look at it from the perspective of the consolidated sovereign meaning government as a single entity, they are swapping a soft, unenforceable internal IOU for a hard, enforceable external liability with the IMF, but placing the hard asset squarely in the central bank.
And Governor Bausili was really open about this, wasn't he?
He was remarkably blunt about the utility of this during his FCE-UBA session. He stated, and I quote the translation directly, "To have the asset of those colorful little papers, I prefer to win dollars or not have anything."
Which is entirely rational. If I'm running the central bank, I would vastly prefer to hold 12 billion real usable dollars than 70 billion fake dollars that I can't actually spend.
Exactly.
But we need to break down the exact math of this swap, because this is where the accounting mechanics get incredibly intricate, and it sets the stage for a major controversy.
It absolutely does.
So the central bank gives up papers that have just been aggressively devalued, right? They were marked down to a book value of roughly $12 billion for this specific tranche. But what did the Treasury actually pay to buy them back in this internal swap?
This is where we must look closely at the ledger entries. The BCRA surrenders papers that they are currently carrying at a written down, JAP-compliant book value of $12 billion. However, the internal sale price negotiated between the Treasury and the central bank was not set at that 33% rock bottom value.
Okay, so what was it set at?
It wasn't set at the full 100% nominal face value either. It was negotiated at an intermediate value of roughly $18 billion equivalent.
Wait, let me make sure I follow the math here.
Take your time.
The central bank hands over an asset they're officially valuing at 12, but the Treasury agrees to buy it back at a valuation of 18. That means the central bank just instantly generated an accounting profit, a capital gain, on that specific slice of the swap.
Yes.
Why would the Treasury agree to an intermediate price? Why not just buy it back at the 33% mark-to-market value?
The intermediate pricing is a function of navigating those legal complexities we discussed earlier. Because the Treasury legally owes par, but the central bank books it at recoverable value, any cancellation requires a negotiated settlement price between the two agencies.
I see.
By settling at an intermediate value, the Treasury gets a massive haircut on its nominal debt, while the central bank realizes a massive gain over its written down book value.
So they meet in the middle.
Exactly. And when you aggregate this mechanism across the operations cited in the sources, the overall accounting difference generated between the already shredded, revalued 33% asset, the $12 billion, and the new negotiated swap value, the $18 billion, created a massive total capital gain for the BCRA.
Which was how much?
The sources cite this figure as circa $13.2 billion equivalent when you factor in the broader portfolio and exchange rates.
So the central bank just generated roughly a $13.2 billion profit on paper, simply based on the gap between the mark-to-market loss they took in 2024 and the negotiated realization price they agreed to.
Correct. It is a realized accounting profit on the books. Now, it is crucial to note that Operation A itself was fully and transparently explained to the citizens, the press, the Congress, everybody.
No problem there.
Right. There was no deception regarding the influx of the IMF funds. It brought real dollars into the vault. But what was not very explicit was the creation of this $13.2 billion equivalent accounting difference.
And in the Argentine system, this accounting profit is referred to as utilidades, right?
Yes. And this massive pile of utilidades sets the absolute foundation for the sequel, Operation B.
And sequels are always messier.
Very much so. Operation B takes place around May 2026. The BCRA now has this massive $13.2 billion equivalent accounting profit sitting on its books. By law, the central bank is often required or permitted to distribute its realized profits to the Treasury as a dividend.
Okay, so the Treasury requests that distribution.
Right. What was not so evident to everyone was that this accounting difference was going to be distributed back to the Treasury. The central bank transfers that profit, which amounts to roughly 18.4 trillion Argentine pesos, to the Treasury.
Okay, so the Treasury receives this massive dividend payout. What do they do with it?
The Treasury immediately takes that distributed 18.4 trillion pesos and uses it to cancel even more of the nominal Letras intransferables still sitting on the central bank's balance sheet.
Hold on, let me map this out so the listener can see the sheer circularity of this. The central bank makes a profit on paper due to an internal pricing gap. It hands that paper profit over to the Treasury. The Treasury then takes that exact same paper profit, walks it right back across the street, and hands it back to the central bank to cancel more of its internal debt.
That is exactly what happened. It is pure entry versus entry, a closed loop of accounting.
It's like finding a monopoly money printing press in your basement, paying yourself a dividend, and using it to pay off the mortgage you owe yourself.
We have to critique Operation B impartially here, relying strictly on the rigorous analysis provided by Grok and Claude.
Right.
What is fascinating, and frankly highly questionable here, is the stark contrast in transparency and real economic impact between the two operations.
Because Operation A brought in real money.
Exactly. Operation A brought in real, liquid IMF dollars. It genuinely and structurally strengthened the central bank's ability to defend the national currency. Operation B, however, is questionable because it's just paper accounting, not real money.
It adds absolutely zero real value to the central bank. It's cosmetic.
Exactly. It utilizes unrealized or internally generated paper profits to cancel paper debt, adding no real hard asset backing to the monetary base. Replacing bad interpublic claims with liquid international reserves in Operation A is a massive tangible win.
But conflating those real dollars with the cosmetic paper cancellations in Operation B obscures the underlying truth.
Yes, it creates an unnecessary institutional credibility risk. And this leads us directly to the core of the controversy. How this entire restructuring was communicated to the public, which resulted in a massive misunderstanding about the nation's total debt load.
Which is the perfect entry point to discuss the math of Paltering and the consolidated debt illusion.
It's a critical concept.
The analysis uses this very specific word Paltering. It's not a common term. How do the sources define it in this macroeconomic context?
Paltering is an established concept in social science and political communication. It refers to the act of making statements that are strictly technically truthful, but which are deliberately deployed to create a misleading impression in the mind of the audience.
Truthful, but structurally misleading. Give me the specific example of how this occurred with these debt operations.
The primary claim analyzed in the annex is the government's public assertion, following these swap operations, that they achieved a massive reduction in total public debt.
Well, did they? If the Treasury canceled billions of dollars of Letras, didn't the debt technically go down?
If you look exclusively at gross debt, yes, the headline number decreases. But to understand why presenting this as a genuine reduction in the public debt burden is deeply misleading, we have to perform a rigorous academic breakdown of what consolidated debt actually means.
Okay.
And I will note, as our sources do, that even tech-savvy analysts in academia, and frankly some officials within the central bank, calculate net consolidated debt differently, which just adds to the confusion.
Okay, let's cut through the confusion. Let's build a consolidated balance sheet right now for the listener. Walk me through the actual math.
Let's use simple variables. Imagine the Treasury issues a $100 Letra intransferable whole and places it in the central bank. On its ledger, the Treasury records a liability, a debt of $100.
And the central bank records an asset of $100.
Right. Now, if we want to know the true debt of the sovereign state as a whole, we have to consolidate them. We combine the two entities into one.
So you add them together, you have a positive 100 on the central bank side and a negative 100 on the Treasury side.
Exactly. Positive 100 minus 100 equals 0. If you always subtracted BCRA asset against Treasury debt for these Papelitos, whatever the valuation, it would be 0. X minus X equals 0, or Y minus Y equals 0.
Right.
It does not matter if the liter is valued at $100 nominal dollars or marked down to $33 of recoverable value. The net consolidated debt between the two sister agencies is mathematically 0. It entirely cancels out.
So if the debt between them is functionally 0, how can the government claim that canceling it reduced the total public debt?
The issue is when people carelessly talk about consolidated debt without the word net, or even worse, they just use gross debt. They do not subtract X minus X or Y minus Y.
Wow.
And then, depending on the valuations and what you subtract from what, you can make a lot of paltering.
I see the trick. If the central bank marks their asset down to 33, but the Treasury is still technically carrying a gross liability of 100, the Treasury can buy it back for 33 and loudly announce, we just eliminated $100 of debt and it only cost us 33. We reduced the national debt by $67.
That is the precise solution. It is a valuation gap artifact. As the independent economists cited in the report meticulously point out, if you treat the BCRA and the Treasury as a single consolidated debtor, Operation A actually demonstrates the opposite of a debt reduction.
How so?
Because replacing internal zero net paper debt with real IMF debt actually increases the real enforceable debt owed to third parties.
Because you owe the IMF real hard currency that you eventually have to pay back, whereas you owed yourself fake money that just canceled itself out.
Exactly. You swapped a soft, unenforceable internal IOU for a hard, enforceable external liability. The exigibility, the actual hardness and legal enforceability of the debt rises significantly.
Right.
Therefore, to present a gross face value decline in internal paper as a reduction in total public debt, while simultaneously ignoring the new hard IMF debt and the complete lack of real backing in Operation B, is the essence of paltering. It is technically true on a gross non-consolidated ledger, but deeply misleading regarding the true macroeconomic burden on the state.
This makes Bausili's comments at the university even more staggering. Yeah, we're talking about the sitting central bank governor. How did he defend this discrepancy at the FCE-UBA session?
He didn't defend it really, he exposed it. It was a moment of remarkable, almost unprecedented candor for a sitting official of his rank.
What did he say?
Bausili openly called the valuation of these intergovernment debts an accounting game between agencies. He literally told the academic audience that if you ask different financial actors how to calculate the consolidated debt, you get entirely different answers depending on their motives.
Wow. He said, and I'm quoting the translation, rating agencies don't distinguish it. The fund doesn't distinguish it. A colleague does. I don't, you don't, and it's a mess.
It's a mess. The chief architect of the nation's monetary policy openly admitting that the calculation of the national debt is functionally subjective based on who is doing the math.
He was acknowledging a profound truth. A magnitude that changes wildly depending on who computes it and what frame they select, net versus gross, nominal versus recoverable, is, by definition, not an objective reality. It is a narrative choice.
That's a great way to frame it.
Net and consolidated are just frame selections. The underlying truth is that society does not feel any tangible difference when one government agency quietly writes down a debt to another government agency.
But if society doesn't feel the internal accounting tricks, they absolutely feel the real-world impact of the original crime.
Oh, absolutely. If the debt wasn't magically reduced today, and the central bank's real reserves were truly drained of $70 billion between 2006 and 2023, the obvious question any rational citizen would ask is, where did the money go, and who actually paid the bill?
That is perhaps the most profound question in all of macroeconomics. If the monetary base, the physical pesos in circulation in bank accounts, lost its hard currency backing over 17 years, why didn't the money supply contract?
Right. Under historical gold standard, if gold leaves the vault, the bank must retire the paper receipts, shrinking the money supply.
Correct. If the backing disappears, the paper should disappear. But we do not live under a gold standard. We must analyze this through the mechanics of a fiat regime.
Okay, break that down for me.
In a fiat system, when the real backing of a currency deteriorates, the equilibrating variable is almost never the quantity of money. The equilibrating variable is the value of the money. Specifically, the adjustment happens through the price level and the exchange rate.
Let's make sure the mechanics of that are crystal clear. You're saying that instead of the government taking pesos out of people's pockets to balance the lost dollars, the pesos stayed in their pockets, but their purchasing power just evaporated.
Precisely. And the situation in Argentina was actually far worse than a static money supply losing backing. The quantity of money didn't stay flat. It expanded aggressively through unbacked monetary emission to finance the Treasury's ongoing deficits.
They just kept printing.
The central bank was printing trillions of new pesos at the exact same time it was losing its hard dollars. So, with the money supply rapidly rising while the real backing plummeted, the entirety of the macroeconomic adjustment fell on the currency itself.
It's the mechanical reality of watering down soup at a restaurant.
Yeah.
You have 10 customers, but only enough broth for 5. You don't take away 5 bowls. You fill all 10 bowls, but you cut it with hot water until the soup is practically tasteless. You still have 10 bowls, but the nutritional value, the purchasing power is destroyed.
And society is the one forced to consume it. We must make this abundantly clear, because this is the emotional and economic core of the entire 17-year saga. Society already paid for the pillage of the BCRA.
They paid the bill.
They didn't pay through a sudden organized balance sheet contraction where the government transparently taxed them to fill a $70 billion hole. They paid through 17 years of relentless compounding inflation and massive currency devaluation.
The ultimate invisible tax.
Exactly. The peso was simply liquefied while the public lived through it. Emptying the central bank reserves didn't require a future monetary contraction to mathematically pay for itself. Inflation paid the bill in real-time installments day by day by systematically destroying the purchasing power of the citizens' wages and savings.
It's brutal when you lay it out like that.
As the Claude and Grok analysis acutely notes, the public sees the loss without necessarily understanding the complex balance sheet plumbing.
Yeah.
They simply lived it as relentless inflation.
Now, I want to pause here and issue a crucial impartiality check for you, the listener.
Very important.
Because when we spend all this time detailing massive devaluations, $40 billion accounting write-downs, paltering, and the devastating invisible tax of inflation, it is incredibly easy, and human nature really, to direct your anger at the officials currently holding the press conferences.
Naturally.
But based on the rigorous analysis of the sources, we have to be absolutely clear. Do not shoot the messenger.
This is a vital point of economic context. The current government, which took office on December 10th, 2023, did not cause this specific $70 billion structural hole. They inherited it.
Right.
They are merely the administration putting this ugly pre-existing reality onto the official balance sheet. They are just trying to clear the prior government's fiscal and monetary disorder.
The mess was already there.
The aggressive mark-to-recoverable value approach mandated by Decree 280 was not an act of disruption. It was an honest recognition of a past pillage. It forced institutional transparency where there had only been fiction.
They didn't crash the car. They were just the mechanics who finally put it up on a lift, pointed at the rusted frame, and wrote up the terrifying repair estimate. They were just being honest about the rust.
Yes, that's exactly it. And while the independent analysis rightly critiques the cosmetic, paper-shuffling nature of Operation B and calls out the paltering and the public relations messaging around debt reduction, the foundational structural move to clean the books was entirely necessary.
Okay, so the books are finally being cleaned. The mathematical reality of the 17-year inflation tax has been laid bare on the ledger. But understanding the past and cleaning the present doesn't secure the future.
No, it doesn't.
How does Argentina prevent this exact cycle from repeating? How do you ensure that in 2030 or 2035, some future government facing a deficit doesn't just start writing sticky notes and shoving them into the central bank all over again?
That is the ultimate test of this entire stabilization exercise. Right now, this monumental cleanup is being executed primarily via executive decrees like Decree 280/2024.
Which are fast, but
Decrees are highly powerful and fast-acting, but they are relatively easy for a future executive to unilaterally overturn. We've already seen this exact vulnerability. A previous interim government tried to value these assets correctly, and the subsequent Kirchnerista administration simply reversed it with a stroke of a pen in 2019.
live by the decree, die by the decree. It's a fragile foundation for national currency.
Extremely fragile. To achieve true, durable institutional independence and market credibility, the country must move beyond executive decrees to permanent legislative reform.
And what do the sources suggest for that?
The sources emphasize the absolute necessity of passing a much stronger BCRA charter reform through the National Congress.
What would that legislative reform actually look like in practice? Like, what specific legal mechanics need to change?
The specific rigorous recommendation derived from the analyses is to make the central bank legally and structurally impenetrable by permanently banning it from holding its own government's bonds.
Just flat out ban it.
Yes, or at the very least, severely restricting the practice of unbacked monetary financing. You have to remove the legal mechanisms that permit fiscal dominance.
Fiscal dominance, let's define that, because it feels like the invisible hand behind this whole story.
Fiscal dominance occurs when the fiscal needs of the Treasury, its deficits and debt obligations, completely dictate the monetary policy of the central bank.
So the Treasury is just running the show.
The Treasury essentially treats the central bank as an unlimited captive ATM. To end this, the law must explicitly sever that link.
You have to permanently take away the sticky notes. You have to make it illegal for the executive branch to ever put an internal IOU into the central bank vault.
Yes. International best practices in central banking favor strict accounting frameworks and asset composition rules that are insulated by law from short-term political pressure.
Because otherwise it's just too tempting.
Exactly. If the central bank is independent by law and its balance sheet is protected by law, then a future government cannot quietly drain the nation's wealth to fund its deficits. The massive credibility gains from this current painful cleanup will evaporate quickly if the international markets perceive it merely as a one-off tactical maneuver by the current administration, rather than a permanent, legally binding regime change.
So after unpacking the decrees, the recoverable value gap accounting, the IMF swaps, and the Paltering, what does this all mean for the bigger picture?
It's about credibility.
At its core, this incredibly complex macroeconomic saga isn't really about accounting at all. It's about trust. A fiat currency is only worth the trust that the citizens and the markets have in the institutions that manage it.
100%.
Transparency, brutal honesty about the balance sheet, and true institutional independence backed by permanent law are the only ways to restore long-term trust in the Argentine peso. You can't fake solvency with accounting tricks, and you cannot hide a $70 billion hole forever.
Because eventually, the equilibrating variable of inflation always forces the truth out into the open.
That is a perfect synthesis of the macroeconomic reality. The math always reconciles, eventually. If the government refuses to reconcile it on the official balance sheet, the economy will mercilessly reconcile it in the supermarkets.
Exactly.
Which brings us to our close. We've taken a very deep, technically rigorous dive into the specific mechanics of Argentina's macroeconomic cleanup. We've looked at the plumbing of how a nation attempts to rebuild its financial foundation. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a broader, perhaps more provocative thought to consider.
If an entire society's wealth can be quietly, systematically drained for 17 years through the invisible tax of inflation, all while the official government balance sheets look perfectly healthy, legally compliant, and balanced at full par value,
It raises a chilling question for the rest of the global economy.
it really does.
What other accounting fictions might currently be hiding in the ledgers of central banks around the world today? Where else is a sovereign government pointing to a financial ledger and saying, look, our balance sheet is perfectly healthy, when the reality beneath the surface is just a multi-billion-dollar sticky note?
It forces you to wonder just how many other PapelitosdeColores are quietly sitting in the vaults of developed and developing nations alike, waiting for their own version of Decree 280 to force a brutal reckoning with economic reality.
It really does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We know we threw a massive amount of heavy macroeconomic theory and accounting mechanics your way today, but understanding the complex plumbing beneath the simple headlines is the only way to truly see how the global economy works. Until next time, keep looking past the surface.